Thank you all, and thank you, Anselm. Thank you for the opportunity to hear Lawrence's wonderful presentation, and for humoring my technology problems. I have a very old laptop which I'm holding on to forever until it falls dead on me because it has exactly the keyboard I want. Right. So I'm going to be talking about something that is quite closely related to both of the things that Anselm and Lawrence were talking about, and that is the development of what I think of as a distinctive mode of capitalism, which will apply to a large area of the world and to a very large portion of the global population. I think when people think about biometrics, in Europe in particular, to some degree in the United States, they're accustomed to thinking of it in terms of as an instrument of political surveillance, somewhat like the things that Lawrence is talking about. So the National Security whatever it is, the NSA's attempt to try and monitor people and to track their movements around the world. It's no question that the states that have gone furthest in pushing biometric registration systems on their populations are what we would call the counterinsurgent states or the anti-communist states. The state in Europe that's taken this further is Spain. It's not an accident. It is a path dependency. It's related to the history of the 20th century. Argentina, Chile, Malaysia, Pakistan, and South Africa are the ones who've gone furthest in developing fingerprint registration systems. And the US Department of Homeland Security is unquestionably the main global agent, using the doctrine of defense in depth. So their idea is we go out and fingerprint people in Afghanistan or in Iraq, then we'll find them when they come back to the United States. And Chertoff, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security, has explicitly endorsed biometrics on these grounds. Now, to go back to Mick Tarsick is the one who initially drew our attention to the fact that what we're looking at when people make arguments like this is in fact an argument about sympathetic magic. Because there is no capacity to use what we would call fingerprint fragments or latent fingerprints to identify people or the activities of people in safe houses or in bombs. It just doesn't work like that. What you can do with 10 good fingerprints is one thing. Taking a fraction of a fingerprint, I would say there was no respectable biometrician, and I'm talking about the scientists, who would sign off in a court to the kinds of claims that the NSA makes. But they are working on it very energetically, and who knows, maybe there will be a mathematical proof sometime in the future. In fact, what we're looking at is biometrics affecting the poorest people in the world much more dramatically than the national security targets. Now, capitalism is a funny business on the African continent. For most of the last century, more people, vastly more people, have been involved in agriculture and in trade, but the form of capitalism and the institutions that capitalism is dependent on has been dependent very largely on mining and on mineral extractions, and in particular in the last 10 years on oil. It's these things that have dominated investment, they've dominated state revenues, company revenues, individuals' incomes, and especially property forms. So the forms of mineral titles that people have been able to exchange and make enormous amounts of money without ever actually exploiting anything, those are the things that have been dominant in the form of capitalism that developed in Africa. The actual system itself has been described by scholars in many different ways. Some of you will know Jim Ferguson's work, and he stressed what we would call the enclaved character. In other words, an oil company will come in and it'll set up the infrastructure it needs in a very small space and more or less ignore 99% of the territory. This is an extension of an argument from Walter Rodney, who always drew people's attention to the rails of line, the railway lines that run from the harbor to the mine and ignore the populations. We're familiar with Jean-François Bayart's theory of extroversion, or Fred Cooper's take on it, which is to stress the gatekeeping quality of the state. We know Jane Geyer's excellent work on the ways in which Africans have actually reworked systems of value on the continent, and the large amount of work that focuses on the intrinsically violent nature of capitalism in Africa. Now, the story I'm interested in talking about tonight is different, and it breaks with the most influential explanations, some of these are my good friends, of Africa's place in world capitalism. And these are people who typically, almost as a matter of political principle, deny the viability of a single project of capitalist transformation on the continent. Excuse me, I'm going to grab some of this. Now, my argument is much closer to Jim Ferguson's, and some of you may know his recent book, Give a Man a Fish. He argues that emerging from South Africa is a doctrine that says a basic income grant is just about the only way of handling the contemporary problems of capitalism in Africa, but probably many other places as well. And I draw extensively as well on D.A. Mackenzie's work on the problems of redistribution in a world without work, without formal work, where financial institutions dominate the production of value on it using algorithms and automated systems of calculation. Now, there is a long and excellent tradition of argument that capitalism isn't one thing, despite what Marx has said about it. My own particular interest is in the work of a man called Maurice Sklar, who looks at the development of corporations in the United States and argues that there is a distinctive mode, distinctive forms of property, distinctive kinds of political association that develop in the United States around 1910, and we would say many of those things have persisted into the present, some have not. It's well established now that there are many different kinds of capitalism, many ways to skin the cat. And different regional modes have distinctive forms of property. Different kinds of intangible forms of property, in particular, are developed by particular kinds of law. And these things are important because, as you'll see where I'm going, they reflect political order and they reflect conflicts. So what is biometric capitalism? Well, biometric capitalism is a system of economic activity organized around a centralized unitary database of biometrically ordered population registration, where the identification is done on the basis typically of people's fingerprints or some other object on the body like the iris that can allow for unique identification or close to unique identification. It's justified morally and politically by the politics and the technologies of cash transfers. Now, this is where, as happens in South Africa, 40% of the population receive a monthly cash transfer, a cash payment from the state. The only way in which that can really be done effectively is through a biometric system. And there are many tentative forms of a similar basic income grant on the African continent. I won't bore you with the examples, but most states are experimenting with some way of directing cash into the lives of the vast majority of people who are locked out of formal work. And it's integrated with the requirements on the African continent uniquely of the commercial banks. And the banks are the ones who are often funding the development of these population registers. So they are developing shared infrastructures for credit surveillance that are derived from the original FICO scores. I'm sure people have some familiarity with those scores, and the Americans are very familiar with them. They determine the mortgage that you pay usually in the United States. And the FICO algorithm has spread very widely around the world, and it has been adopted very enthusiastically in the last 5 years. Drawing on automatically generated feedback data from already existing mass credit and welfare transfer systems, non-governments and governments are pushing the development of tracking systems around cash transfer schemes and student loans. So if you paid any attention to what happened in South Africa last year, the students' big complaint is that the debt that they have to cover their university, which is actually most of it not for fees but for subsistence, is handed over to the banks. If they don't service the loan, they're black-marked very quickly. That is the first thing an employer queries when you go and apply for work. In other words, have you been servicing your debt? And if you haven't been servicing your debt, you don't get shortlisted for an interview. You lose your opportunity to actually develop employment that will ever allow you to pay back the loan. Those loan schemes exist in almost all countries on the continent. Now, these systems are very strongly influenced by infrastructures of biometric government and banking that were first developed in South Africa over the course of the last century. It's very important to understand that biometric capitalism confronts two fundamental problems about the nature of the state and the economy on the African continent. And the first of these is that unlike the conventional Weberian and Foucauldian understandings of power knowledge, states on the African continent have managed to persist and sometimes to thrive with radically constrained knowledge about their populations. Most births and most deaths are still not recorded. In South Africa, we have a sophisticated state. We only started recording a majority of births in 2002. The census data is incomplete everywhere. It's non-existent in many places. It's contested almost everywhere as well. And it has been like this for the last 50 years, and it was like this throughout the colonial period. Unlike India, African colonial states did not count their populations. They had no interest, really, in anyone except the white people who lived in the cities. Registration of people and land, especially, is very limited. It's fragmented and tentative. And this means bureaucratic systems of identification, the birth registers, the birth certificates people are very commonly aware of, are weak throughout the continent. And it's important to have in mind, while you're thinking about this, that biometrics and paper-based registration systems have been in conflict on the African continent for a century. It's not new. So 100 years ago, the colonial officials were saying, don't listen to Africans, they'll lie about who they are. The only way you can know for sure is if you record their fingerprints. And much the same juxtaposition exists today. It hasn't gone anywhere. So that's the first problem, which is the fundamental official incapacity of the state. The second is demography. And I don't think people are as aware or alert or as conscious of this as they should be, that most African states have experienced dramatic increases in population over the last generation, going from comparatively low densities to some of the highest ever recorded. Now, there's a very rich, fascinating debate in African history over the facts and implications of population density. There's a whole group of historians who argue what is distinctive about Africa is the low population density. This is people like John Iliff and Jan Isaac van Sina. They say all the arguments about politics, the precious character of life, the fact that people don't value land, they value people much more than land. There's a huge dispute about whether, in fact, this is the case, and there are a group of historians who say that the estimates are in fact too low, that there were a much higher population in the 1700s than those people acknowledge. But let's just go over the possibilities. In 1800, there was some number between 50 and 140 million people in the African continent. This is the whole continent, including North Africa. In 1900, some number between 100 and 150 million. By 1950, something around 230 million people. By 2000, the figure had reached 1 billion. By 200, the current UN estimate is that for 2050, it will be between 2 and 2.5 billion, and that by the end of the century, there'll be between 4 and 6 billion people on the African continent. They'll make up something like 50% of the human beings on the planet. This will be the highest concentration of human life ever recorded, higher than China or the Netherlands. So something has to be done, and most states are scrambling to build bureaucratic mechanisms to get a grip on it. In each case, we can see a convergence towards an administrative architecture that emerged first in South Africa. It's radically centralized biometric identity registration, privatized biometric cash transfers, universal credit histories that come to serve as a kind of instrument of moralization. So when nothing else really works, we can identify what kind of person you are by looking at your credit history. Now, these things depend on all sorts of tools. There's a kind of proliferation of devices, and some of those devices are being made available and spread through the continent by election systems that are usually funded by the European Union. There are other examples around the world, and I won't belabor them. The most important is Nilekani's UID project in India. And we can say a lot about it. There are two things that stand out. The first is that this is not a card, it's a number. You just get a number. It is a purely intangible object. People have demanded a card, and lots of them have started laminating these paper receipts. But that's not what you're getting from the government. What you get from the government is a number only. The second thing is that 1 billion people have been registered in the last 5 years, which makes it by far the most successful registration project ever attempted. There's never been anything else quite like that. These biometric kits, which are being used to register people under Aadhaar for elections on the African continent and for almost all the ID card schemes that exist, are in themselves a kind of actor network. There's an obvious presence all over the continent of globally standardized cheap smart cards, wired and wireless networks, XML of minutiae abstraction systems, cheap Logitech imaging devices, and you should just pay attention to whenever you're wandering through an immigration portal and see how much kit now exists to make it easy for the state to capture our biometrics. Like the world of mathematical abstraction in general, that Theo Porter and others have described, or the feedback engines that Zuboff and Noble have examined in factories, biometric systems are intrinsically about simplification. They circumscribe curiosity, consent, knowledge-making, and speech. And yet the alternatives, which amount to building states through literacy, through teaching everybody about the importance of written registration and of written bureaucracy, seem to me similarly untenable. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of how this works in South Africa. Part of my project here is to draw attention to the way these new state forms draw on the specific history of the South African state. And there's little acknowledgement of this in the World Bank literature or any of the other literatures on the story of biometrics. And the South African story, for those of you who know anything about the history, has been a conflict over fingerprint registration that has taken place in every generation back into 1900. It's a much longer conflict, for example, than the Third Reich. These produced by the late 1980s automated systems for biometrically distributing cash payments in the KwaZulu homeland. Incidentally, Lawrence, they first tried sound recognition, and they couldn't get they couldn't get people to be calm enough about it. So I'm not sure, I've never actually looked in detail at it. And they were initially reluctant to use fingerprinting, thinking that people would associate it with the apartheid state. But in fact, the balance of probabilities pushed everybody into using fingerprinting simply because it was what everybody understood, the subjects and the officials. So this leverages a century of coercive centralized biometric registration and technologies of identification that were fostered by mining. It's also important to see that the kit that people were using was in every sense just the same cheap Windows-based standardized equipment you could find today. These are older machines, these are from the 1990s, but all the tools that were being used were ultimately exactly the same systems being used by companies like Unisys, who were providing technology to the banks. So that's the software. This is what the cash transfer, the front end looks like. Those are essentially ATM machines that are hooked up to a little biometric reader. You can't see it very clearly, but it's in the middle of the picture on the left-hand side. And this has fostered the development of a company that I call the anti-bank, Net1 UEPS. It's a private company that is now the direct agent of what we could call the South African model of biometric government. It has contracts with for government grants and pensions in Namibia, Botswana, Malawi, Zimbabwe. It had them in Iraq, and also I'll show you a little more about Ghana. This company is explicitly targeting offline, illiterate bank customers, what are called unbanked populations. There's an enormous amount of churn and anxiety around the company. It has been subject to a great many legal disputes, including, for example, the current tender, which is a 220 billion rand tender for the payment of grants. They are being forced to reissue that tender. Nonetheless, there is no mistaking the momentum of the company in capturing people in Southern Africa and around the world. There are 22 million people who exist inside the Net1 database itself. It's a separate system. It's not the same one used by the government. And essentially what they are doing in their business model is to provide a banking infrastructure. So they are lending to the people who are being paid grants by the government. And of course, they have access to all the revenue, all the income those people earn, so they can lend to them without any risk at all. And one of the most interesting things was that the World Bank last week bought 10% of this company for $100 million. So the link between these biometric systems in the South African model is to connect it very closely to credit surveillance, which didn't really even exist in South Africa in 1990. So between 1990 and 2016, what we've seen is the extension of the American system of automated information about your credit, not only what you borrow, but also what you pay off on your utility bills, as a means of gathering your suitability, gathering information about your suitability as a bank customer. So the credit reference bureaus collect your name, your identity number, your address, who your employer is, your debts and payments on your telephone accounts, your cable TV, cell phone contracts, your municipal utility bills, your credit cards and mortgages. Now, this is common. It's not only, this is, the model is used everywhere now. The distinction in South Africa is it's just about all that the state has as a moralizing instrument. So if I'm an employee of a local municipality, the way I decide whether you're a virtuous tenant is I look up your credit history. And there are something like 20 million individual profiles in the system in South Africa. 50% of them are what we would call blacklisted customers. They can't get access to credit. They can't typically get access to any of the things that they're asking for, whether that's access to a rent or to the opportunity for employment. Now, this system, over the last 5 years, has begun to move very rapidly around the continent. And the first is while we're talking about truth-making, the first is that this fantasy of capturing the unbanked lay behind the first system of biometric cash, or biometric money, ever implemented on the planet. In 2007, Net1 was awarded a contract by the Central Bank of Ghana for a national banking switch that requires all bank customers to identify themselves biometrically. And in theory, it didn't work like this in practice, but in theory, all transactions were supposed to be biometrically authenticated. So you have to put your fingerprint on the reader, somebody else has to, in order to move money from one bank to the account. Now, the scheme has been a dismal failure. I think that's probably the most clear thing you can say about it. The machines don't work very well. They don't access the cellular network. In general, people have been very reluctant to use it. Ghanaians haven't taken very kindly to the idea that they should be subjected to a different technology to the ones that they might use if they were in London. So there's been resistance from the rich. And in fact, one of the astonishing things is the poor don't have any money. So, nevertheless, what lay behind the e-switch is an obsession with bankrolling, with controlling payrolling and getting ghost employees out of the bureaucracy. And it's that interest in separating out duplications within the government bureaucracy itself that remains. The most outrageous of these schemes was the announcement in 2013 in Cape Town that MasterCard would actually be issuing the Federal Republic of Nigeria's identity card. I won't elaborate, but if you just think about that for a minute, there's a lot I could say. And I have a great deal of sympathy with the officials responsible for implementing this system. I would probably do the same thing myself, but there's no question that it sets in place an astonishing precedent, and there is very, very little legal apparatus in place to deal with it. Of course, many of these things don't work. You just have to deal with large, any bricklayer is never going to be biometrically captured, and there isn't currently a way of dealing with them. After a decade of issuing identity cards, Nigerians have still only issued to 10 million people, right? So there are 160 million Nigerians. This is not going terribly efficiently. What I want to draw your attention to, however, is how the model remains in place. So I'm going to read a little bit. It's going to take me a minute. There's no sign, in other words, of official hesitation or remorse. This is from the Daily Nation last year. Kenyans will be registered afresh next year in a project that will cost 9 billion shillings. The biometric registration, to be funded by the government and the private sector, is part of a plan to boost revenue collection by mapping potential taxpayers. It is expected to curb rising cases of terrorism and crime by uprooting criminals and illegal foreigners. The end result is that we're going to have a population register with every Kenyan, and from that we're going to issue digital identity cards that will have information about all citizens in the country, said Ms. Gatabaki, who's the national registrar. The registration will start in February 2015, with a listing of foreigners set to start in April. From October, passports, national identification cards, and logbooks will have biometric data of individuals, which the government can access electronically. Children under 12 years will have their irises scanned. The register will also capture land details, assets, and registered companies, with a view of enlisting those within the tax bracket who are not paying duty. The government has no, a coffin, you're going to pick it up. The government has set aside 1 billion shilling for the project, but anticipates that the private sector, under a public-private partnership, will finance the rest. Some of the costs are to be recovered through data vending to key institutions, especially those in financial services. The governor of the Central Bank of Kenya said that apart from its potential to mitigate risks in financial services arising from identity theft, This will allow the banks to identify their customers more effectively. So what is biometric capitalism and where is it happening? Well, banks and states are now in an intimate embrace, funding each other's work. Global corporations, donors, and the kit manufacturers all act together in a network. Laura Mann, who's recently finished her PhD on this, in looking at it in Kenya, is correct in describing a new industrial policy that favors the creation, accumulation, and sharing of data, currently without meaningful privacy limits, hinged on the creation of biometric national population registers that are hooked into the credit history system. Now, this apparatus is antagonistic to the strategies of subsistence and accumulation that have dominated on the continent to this date. It's hostile, in fact, to many of the things I described earlier, the forms of resource extraction, gatekeeping, extroversion, mutualized property forms, and border transgressions. And in that sense, it's actually a definite improvement. But there are some sinister and, in fact, distressing forms, new forms of coercively imposed civic virtue that will require people to act as individualized entities and be preoccupied with their algorithmically generated reputation. Personal debt, debt service, and the risks around the servicing of those debts are becoming the dominant forms of property and profit on the continent in an economic landscape where mineral titles have long predominated. This is capitalism in a world with very weak states, especially at the local government level, without formal work, where growth is demographic and where personal debt is the most valuable resource. Thank you very much.